This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is your show for Tuesday, October 18th, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. And with me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Q-Bongs?
Christina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everybody.
We have a great show for you today. We have an interview with Newman from Bad Science Watch, and I'm going to talk to you about the origins of Halloween. Ooh. But first, Cristina is going to explore why 420 has become associated with marijuana.
Well, this is the Reality Check's 420th episode.
Ooh.
So in honor of the 420th episode, I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the myths surrounding the ubiquitous term 420. The term has long been associated with cannabis culture, but even people who are aware of the connection can be hard-pressed to tell you its origin. So let's start by debunking some of the more popular theories out there about 420. There's a fajillion of them, so I'm only going to touch upon the ones that seem to be a little more popular than others. 420 is a police radio code for marijuana smoking in progress. So this is one theory I bought into in high school. And Pat also mentioned that he believed this. Mm-hmm. Although it's true that the Las Vegas Police Department uses the radio code 420, it has nothing to do with marijuana. The code is used for homicide. If you're a CSI Las Vegas fan, you've probably heard the code used on the show as well. And that's because the codes they use on the show are the ones they actually use at the LVPD. 420 refers to the penal code section for marijuana use in California. As Snopes.com summarizes, Section 420 of the California Penal Code actually refers to obstructing entry on public land. Some other states also have 420 penal codes, but none of them have anything to do with pot. I link to a legal, longer definition of the code in the show notes. 420 is the number of a bill in the U.S. Congress legalizing weed. California Senate Bill 420, also known as the Medical Marijuana Program Act, regulates marijuana use for medical purposes. True. But it was signed by the Governor of California in 2004, which is several years after the term 420 became well entrenched in popular culture. So the person who named this bill obviously has a great sense of humor, and I read to this day no one is actually really sure who named the bill. 420 originated in Amsterdam, where 4:20 p.m. is the cannabis equivalent of tea time. As compelling as it may be to make a connection, the term has nothing to do with when people light up in Holland, nor is it the date that pot was legalized in Amsterdam. Lastly, the Grateful Dead popularized the term, having always stayed in room 420 on tour. Now, although Deadheads, who are Grateful Dead fans, are credited with helping spread the term 420, which I'll talk about shortly, the band's production spokesman has debunked this one on more than one occasion. So, the origin of 420 actually dates back to 1971, when a group of friends from San Rafael High School in California first coined the term, referring to the time they met to smoke pot. Since they got out of school around 3 p.m. and they did sports after school, they would typically meet in front of a statue of French scientist Louis Pasteur and get high at 420. So they began using that term as code. The friends were dubbed the Waldos by virtue of their hangout spot, which was a wall outside the school. When they came into possession of a hand-drawn map that supposedly led them to a hidden marijuana crop northwest of San Francisco, the teens would meet up, get high, and take off on their treasure hunt, which, by the way, they never found.
Maybe they should have done it in a different order and they would have actually found something.
Right? This is what Dave Reddick's, a.k.a. Waldo Dave, who's now a filmmaker, says. We were smoking a lot of weed at the time. Half the fun was just going to look for it. So some of their friends and acquaintances had connections to members of the Grateful Dead, who also started using the term, which spread quickly among the band's fans, affectionately known as Deadheads, as I mentioned before. In 1990, an editor at High Times magazine saw the term explained on a Grateful Dead concert flyer, and then magazine staff started using it and even wrote an article citing 4:20 p.m. as the socially accepted hour of the day to smoke pot, which helped the term go viral. Various members of the Waldos have done interviews and shared letters over the years with postmarks from the 70s referring to 420 to authenticate their claims. But they certainly never envisioned the term would eventually be used worldwide, let alone become a counterculture holiday that people celebrate every year on April 20th.
I know comedian Doug Benson does a lot of his shows at 420. Yeah.
Well, even when we saw him in Toronto,
right, that's
he
what
did
time
it
he did
right
it,
at 420.
So it's still a thing.
Perhaps one day, legislators in the US and Canada will officially declare April 20th National Pot Smoking Day. Until then, I guess we just won't inhale.
I didn't inhale.
There are so many other myths, from Hitler's birthday, which I know Adam mentioned before we started recording the show, and Bob Marley's birthday, and there's, how many chemicals are there in marijuana, that sort of thing, and everything's false. That's the real story.
Welcome to the Reality Check, Jem Newman.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yesterday, I read that you've stepped into the role as chair at Bad Science Watch. So first off, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
We've talked about Bad Science Watch on the show many times, and we've had people on the show who were involved as guests on the podcast. But it's been a while, so maybe we can start with you telling me, what is Bad Science Watch?
Sure. So Bad Science Watch is an independent Canadian nonprofit organization that's been advocating for better science-based policy since 2012. We're a nonpartisan group, so we try to stay politically neutral, and we don't accept any corporate funding at all. Our activities are funded by small personal donations by Canadians,
right,
and we're staffed entirely by volunteers.
You also put out a newsletter, and it was there that I read about some proposed changes with regard to natural health products and also some public consultations that were being undertaken. What are these proposed changes?
So in Canada, natural health products have a separate pathway to licensing than prescription drugs. These products have historically been seen as far safer than prescription medication, and thus the bar for evidence has been quite low.
Right.
But as your listeners may be aware, these products are not without risk. Herbal medicines aren't inert, and they can interact with medication. There have also been several recent cases where natural health products were found to be adulterated with dangerous substances such as heavy metals, or even intentionally with prescription drugs. And many natural health products are specifically promoted as treatments for serious diseases, in which case ineffective treatments may be taking the place of proper medical care. And the bar for evidence for natural health products is shockingly low. So recently, cosmetics and non-prescription medications, over-the-counter drugs like pain or allergy medication, were folded into the Non-Prescription and Natural Health Product Directorate, or NNHPD,
right,
which is the arm of Health Canada that oversees all of these so-called self-care products now. Health Canada has recently released this new set of guidelines for the regulation of these products. And the new regulatory framework uses what they call a risk-based evaluation process.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about quite a bit on the show, actually.
Yeah, it's focused on the claims for cure, treatment, and prevention of disease. And it actually proposes a higher standard of evidence when approving the license of these products, bringing the evidentiary requirement for natural health products up to a comparable level with other medical interventions in a lot of cases. So that's a clear win.
Right.
Products under this framework are sorted into low, medium, and high risk groups, and each group requires different levels of scientific evidence proportional to the risk. Evidence cited for products in the medium and high risk categories would be expected to meet a very reasonable standard of evidence, including proper blinding and randomization and comparison between the new intervention and the current standard of care. Now, this may seem like a relatively low bar to clear, but compared to the current regulatory environment, this is a major improvement.
Yeah, but that sounds like definitely a positive step in the right direction. So what is Bad Science Watch doing with regard to these consultations?
Well, we do see this new framework as an improvement. Unfortunately, the specific basis for which products are grouped into risk categories is not actually clearly defined in the proposal. So we worry that without clear criteria, this risk-based approach may become biased in favor of the product and manufacturer, and therefore less useful as a consumer safety tool.
Right.
The new framework would also allow low-risk products onto the market without evidence, but crucially, it would require that these products feature a disclaimer on their labels to identify claims that are not reviewed by the department. So while this isn't a perfect solution. The fact is that many of these products are currently making their way onto shelves without a meaningful standard of evidence, but with the implied approval of Health Canada, because they are approved for sale.
Right.
So a disclaimer would be an improvement there. So we are hopeful that these changes signal a willingness on behalf of Health Canada to end the dangerous exercise of allowing these products onto the market with claims that have little supporting evidence. And I know that our time is limited. If your listeners are interested in learning more about the strengths and weaknesses of the proposed changes, they can visit badsciencewatch.ca. We'll have a link up there. So from our perspective, we have been involved in the NNHPD consultation process for quite a while. It's common for the directorate to solicit consultation for new monographs. So Bad Science Watch has a standing committee that submits commentary on these consultations, consistently advocating for stronger consumer protection regulations for natural health products. What we'd like to do is encourage all Canadians, especially those who are passionate about science or who have concerns about the current licensing process, to participate in this consultation themselves as well. This consultation process is an opportunity to let Health Canada know where they've succeeded in these new regulations and where we think they need to do more. And if we don't make sure that our voices are heard, we risk being drowned out by the health freedom advocates who want natural health products to be exempt from any form of oversight whatsoever.
Right.
And unfortunately, we are faced with a large lobby group that is attempting, once again, to curtail the movement toward better regulation of these products.
Which is something we saw with Vanessas Law.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bill C-17, which, as you said, is better known as Vanessas Law, expanded the Food and Drug Act to introduce mandatory recall powers, increased fines by, I think, 1,000-fold, and mandated mandatory adverse event reporting for drugs regulated by Health Canada. Unfortunately, natural health products were specifically excluded from the legislation, which leaves them now as the only commercial product class in Canada that the government cannot order a mandatory recall on. So we need to let Health Canada know that while these changes are a good first step, there's still more that they can do to protect and inform consumers.
There's your call to arms, Canadian checkers. Get involved. The deadline is October 24th, so you don't have a lot of time, but you can go, and we'll put all the relevant links in the show notes for this episode. But to get started, as Jem says, you can go to badsciencewatch.ca. So, Jem, before I let you go, aside from your work with Bad Science Watch, you're also involved in something else. Can you tell me a bit about life, the universe, and everything else?
Yeah, Life, the Universe, and Everything Else is a podcast that I produce with some friends over at the Winnipeg Skeptics. As you said, it's not related to Bad Science Watch, but it is a program dedicated to scientific literacy and exploring the world through the lens of science and humanism. In some senses, it's like the reality check. There is a lot of overlap in the kind of topics that we cover, but we tend to do a deep dive on a specific topic every month. And we'll have an hour to an hour and a half panel discussion about different aspects of that topic. So recent topics that we've covered that I'm quite proud of are about a month ago, we talked about the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that aliens have visited Earth in the distant past and had a major impact on the development of the human species. So we talked about chariots of the gods and the Raelians and like that. And we also tackle some, I guess, more serious topics like science's fraught relationship with race and the history of eugenics, which we covered a few months ago as well.
Well, I'm a listener. I recommend that people check it out. Where can they find out more about the podcast?
You can go to winnipegskeptics.com. There's a link right on there. You can also find it on iTunes and Stitcher and the Google Play Store now, too.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch for your time, Jem. Keep up the good work, my friend.
Always a pleasure, Pat. Thanks a lot.
So for those listeners that may not be aware, even though I know Pat's covered it in the past, this came to pass when a Conservative MP in Canada's 15-year-old daughter died of a heart attack while on a prescription drug for a stomach ailment, and then the medication was later deemed unsafe and it was pulled from the market. So he's been fighting ever since for more stringent drug monitoring systems in Canada.
Yeah, I covered this some time back, I think in 2014, because Bad Science Watch at that time was trying to get a revision to include natural health products, right. And in the end, they were not able to do that.
You know what's infuriating to me? At the time, Health Minister Rona Ambrose, in a news conference, told Canadians that they deserve to have confidence in the medications or medicines that they use and know that they're safe. And this is the same woman that ran away from CBC Marketplace host when she was being confronted about that the cold medication, the naturopathic cold medication that was essentially approved without any...
What was made up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was completely made up. Darren covered it on the show, I think. So when I covered Vanessas Law back in 2014, it was at that time a call to arms saying, checkers, please get involved in this. Mm-hmm. And, we weren't able to actually sway things at that time. So here's another chance, guys. Let's get involved.
Yeah, and the opposition's really strong. I'm seeing ads in my Facebook feed and stuff like that saying that the government is planning to take away your supplements and you have to have your voice heard, which is nonsense. But there's a lot of people who, they think this stuff is just like medicine but totally safe, and that's just not how it is. It's nonsense. This stuff doesn't work, and the packaging should reflect that.
Bad Science Watch certainly fights against scary things. Speaking of scary things, Halloween is soon upon us. Perhaps you've seen ads in your Facebook feed for a sexy nurse costume, or a sexy police officer, or a sexy something or other, and you've been confused. Well, silly person, that has no understanding of popular things. That's because Halloween is coming.
Yeah.
In fact, it comes every year, about the same time too. October 31st, at least in part of the world. While we have talked about the origins of Halloween, it was about 7 years ago, so I thought it was worth revisiting. Also, I heard if you don't cover this every 7 years, it's bad luck. My sources are History.com, Live Science, and Huffington Post. All these are available as show notes at our website, trcpodcast.com.
That's a great website.
I've heard that.
There you go, Alex Murdoch.
Halloween's ancient origins is where we begin. So how did society allow you to wear a Batman costume once a year? Think about that. That's pretty cool. It is thought that the origins of Halloween go all the way back to the Celts around 2,000 years ago, who were living in what we now know as Ireland, the UK, and northern France. They celebrated their new year on November 1st, unlike us who are fully objectively correct in celebrating January 1st. For the Celts, this marked the end of summer and the harvest, and that winter was coming, like it always is in the Game of Thrones. This time was often linked to death because they believed that the lines between the living and the dead weren't so clear on New Year's Eve. It was October 31st they celebrated Samhain, or Samhain, looks like Samhain, and this is when the ghosts of the dead came back to the earth. Now, a few of the sources have this Celtic festival being about spirits and the dead, but Benjamin Radford's piece in Live Science says that might not be the case. He quotes a prof from York University, way up here in Canada, named Nicholas Rogers, saying there is no hard evidence that Samhain was specifically devoted to the dead or to ancestor worship. According to the ancient sagas, Samhain was the time when tribal peoples paid tribute to their conquerors and when the ancient mounds might reveal the magnificent places of the gods of the underworld.
People paid tribute to their conquerors.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Rogers believed that the festival was more about seasonal change than death and evil. It is thought that the Druids built huge sacred bonfires, and people paid sacrifice with crops and animals. Nothing like appreciating something by casting it into the fire to help someone else. They also wore costumes, like a sexy fox or a sexy wolf.
Right.
I think that may not be true, but they did seem to wear animal skins and pelts and so on.
It's a really old time, so I don't know if they really had other cultures to appropriate at the time for their sexy costume.
That is true. I think they just went as a sexy druid themselves in their sexiness. So animal skins were actually real, though, so there's some sort of costuming going on. And given that their hearth fires would have burned out while they were at the celebration, happens all the time when I go out, they used the sacred fire from this bonfire to relight them and offer protection in winter. In the early years, and I mean 43 AD early, most Celtic territory had been conquered by the Romans, and over the next 400 years, it seems two main Roman festivals were combined with Samhain. One is Feralia, marked for the passing of the dead, and there was another one, a day to honor Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees. Fast forwarding a bit, as a long quote from History.com, on May 13th, 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome in honor of all Christian martyrs, and the Catholic feast of All Martyrs' Day was established in the Western Church. Pope Gregory III, 731 to 741, later expanded the festival to include all saints as well as all martyrs and moved the observance from May 13th to November 1st. By the 9th century, the influence of Christianity had spread into Celtic lands where it gradually blended with and supplanted the older Celtic rites. In about 1000 AD, the church would make November 2nd All Souls Day, a day to honor the dead. It is widely believed today that the church was attempting to replace the Celtic Festival of the Dead with a related but church-sanctioned holiday. All Souls Day was celebrated similarly to Samhain, with big bonfires, parades, and dressing up in costumes as saints, angels, and devils. The All Saints' Day celebration was also called All Hallows or All Hallowmas, from Middle English All Hallowmas, meaning All Saints' Day. And the night before it, the traditional night of Samhain in the Celtic religion, began to be called All Hallows' Eve, and eventually Halloween.
I find it interesting that they used to dress up as saints, angels, and devils. When I was in school, there were some kids that thought it was wrong to dress up as a devil for Halloween because it was, going against their religion. Well, it sounds like that's what they used to do.
People have fluctuated on that for quite some time. Certainly the ancient Celts didn't really have any notion of a Christian devil.
Sure.
But certainly once Christians are involved, then you shouldn't dress as the devil. As for Halloween in America, in early America there was a meshing of different cultures, Protestant, European, and Native, and there were colonial Halloween festivities which had ghost stories, costumes, and pranks, but this was not widespread. In the second half of the 19th century, 1850s on, immigration to America increased, and this increased the popularity of Halloween. The Irish, fleeing the potato famine in the 1840s, were a large contributor. Personal note, I believe that is how one side of my ancestors came to Canada. Into potato famine.
Interesting.
As for links to modern Halloween practices, Kenneth Davis in Huffington Post said that, quote, when millions of Irish and other Europeans emigrated to America, they carried along their traditions. The age-old practice of carrying home embers in a hollowed-out turnip still burns strong. In an Irish folktale, a man named Stingy Jack once escaped the devil with one of these turnip lanterns. When the Irish came to America, Jack's turnip was exchanged for the more easily carved pumpkin, and Stingy Jack's name lives on in Jack-o'-lantern.
So I want to be old school. I'm going to carve a turnip this Halloween.
Right, and there's also a similar parallel when those ancient druids were taking sacred fire back to their place to illuminate and provide warmth. Yeah. Americans began to dress up and go house to house asking for money or food, a precursor to trick-or-treating. This seems like an odd thing without some context, so History.com says, the American Halloween tradition of trick-or-treating probably dates back to the early All Souls Day parades in England. During the festivities, poor citizens would beg for food and families would give them pastries called soul cakes in return for their promise to pray for the family's dead relatives. The distribution of soul cakes was encouraged by the church as a way to replace the ancient practice of leaving food and wine for roaming spirits. The practice, which was referred to as going a-souling, was eventually taken up by children who would visit the houses in their neighborhood and be given ale, food, and money. Soul cakes is funny. Going a-souling is funny, and giving children ale, of course, is always funny, except you shouldn't do that. Around the turn of the century, the last one that is, Halloween started to become more about parents and children celebrating the day itself with parties and food. But communities were urged to remove anything frightening. This resulted in less religious and mythical links to Halloween. In the 1920s and 30s, Halloween was a secular celebration, but there was a lot of vandalism going on, apparently. But this was reduced in the 1950s by various community actions. As well, the baby boom in the 1950s shifted parties more inside the home or school rather than in the downtown core for ease. Trick-or-treating was revived, and it was thought to be an inexpensive way to have an entire community share in the celebrations. Perhaps it also served to reduce tricks by bribing kids with treats. Another piece of insight to understand modern behaviors, this is from History.com. On Halloween, when it was believed that ghosts came back to the earthly world, people thought that they would encounter ghosts if they left their homes. To avoid being recognized by these ghosts, people would wear masks when they left their homes after dark so that the ghosts would mistake them for fellow spirits. On Halloween, to keep ghosts away from their houses, people would place bowls of food outside their homes to appease the ghosts and prevent them from attempting to enter.
Aren't you Adam Gardner? No, I'm sexy Ebola virus.
I do find history interesting in the sense that you get to understand how things got to be the way they are. If you could take a big step back, like everyone pretty much agrees that you're allowed to dress up, there's candy, there's a pumpkin, and they all have to come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. So ends my overview of the origins of Halloween and how we went from a Druid festival honoring ancestors or conquerors to our modern approach. And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. Cristina showed us that 420 was started by a bunch of crazy high school kids at the time they used to smoke pot. But all the other associations seem a bit too mystical. And Pat gave us a great interview with Jem Newman. Thanks, Jem, for joining us and telling us more about Bad Science Watch and to check out his podcast, Life, the Universe, and Everything. And I gave you a bit on the origins of Halloween. Until next week, think better, act better.
Peace out, Q-bongs.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
What are we doing again? We're recording a show? Whose segment is it? Yeah, but it's just not effective.
It seemed to be effective.
Not efficient. That's going to be the problem at the end of the day. You're not going to get the
so let's cover this on a different show.